Okay, here I am. Okay, forgive me,
Okay.
everybody. Sorry about that. Having trouble with the desktop version of this, but I got it working on my phone. So I haven't heard any of the introductions or anything, so I'm just going to jump right in with the presentation. So Nick and I are here to discuss the current challenges facing medical research in SRNP in the context of some claims and clients that we've been working with here in Ontario and also in Quebec. So let me attempt. I can't actually control the slide thing, so if someone wants to just, there we go. Okay, so basically, we're here to talk about issues that are primarily affecting medical professional corporations. So that would be doctors that have corporations that their clinical fees into. Typically, the that are being affected and are who are trying to actually claim SHRED in these scenarios are clinical scientists who carry out research sort of alongside treating patients and providing clinical care. The way things are set up is these doctors receive their payment by the medical professional corporation, either as a contractor or as an employee in some circumstances. And what these MPCs then do is allocate costs of these payments to the doctors as SR&ED costs for eligible research projects. The way the allocations happen is highly dependent on how the MPC is structured, how the revenue flow is structured, what the practice plan is, and other agreements amongst all the doctors that govern their responsibilities and compensation. So that's just a high-level overview of sort of who we're talking about here in terms of these issues. So currently at CRA, we're seeing them at pretty much virtually trying to deny every single claim along this front, especially for doctors that are affiliated with universities and hospitals. And they have two main prongs to the strategy that they're using to do this. The primary position they're taking is that SHRED is not being carried out on behalf of these medical professional corps, but on behalf of the hospitals and universities by the doctors as individuals. So they're making a distinction between the doctor as an individual working for the hospital or the university and the doctor working for this medical professional corporation where they've pooled their money with a bunch of other doctors and paid it out based on an agreement amongst themselves. The secondary fallback position that we're seeing them use has to do with alternative payment plan and alternative funding plan, that this is government assistance with respect to SHRED. So if they can't win on one, then what they're doing is using option 2 to reduce the claims as much as they possibly can. So what I'm going to kind of go through next is the first position, and then Nick is going to take over for me and talk about the AFP and the funding. So just a couple examples of some opinions that we've gotten from the different SHRED offices of late. So this one is from 2016 from Toronto Centre. Essentially, I put it in there sort of word for word, but the key concepts they talk about here are the lack of contract between the hospital and the medical professional corporation. So there is no formalized relationship where the hospital and the MPC have a contract between them. That the appointments and the duties assigned by the hospital, that is all negotiated between the hospital and the doctors as individuals, and also that the doctors have an affiliation with the university. And in addition to this, there's a requirement or an expectation that they do research as part of these appointments, and basically that this research that they're doing is fulfilling their obligations with the university and hospital, and essentially just that the doctors are not the ones undertaking SHRED for their MPC, it's for the university. And then the next one I have to show you is from Montreal. The circumstance for this one were very similar, even though different province. So once again, they're saying the doctor and his MPC are two separate entities, and the responsibilities that the doctor may have for doing work for another health entity cannot be attributed to the MPC. So again, making this distinction between the doctor and the corporation, and essentially saying, once again, that the research being done is fulfilling the doctor's obligations to the health entity. So on the next slide, I'm going to go over sort of some of the things that CRA is basing their analysis on from what we're seeing. So one thing they're looking at is the appointment letters. So what do the appointment letters say in terms of the obligation of the doctor to the hospital or the university? Typically, you find some minimum obligation of time that they need to be spending on R&D. And we'll get into that a little bit later, what that number usually is. But there is some obligation that says you're expected to do a certain amount of research if you're going to have this appointment at the university. Another thing that we see them looking at is how the results of the research are being published. So whose name is appearing on the papers that get published in the medical journals? Is it the name of the doctor? Does the hospital or university appear there? And basically, in most cases, the name of the medical professional corporation does not appear on the paper. And CRA is using this to say, well, then it's not R&D on or behalf of the MPC. In fact, even in cases where we're not dealing with academic researchers that are affiliated with academic institutions, we've seen CRA come, in financial reviews for doctors that are just working out of their own clinics and have no such appointments where they have obligations saying, well, it's your name on the paper and not the name of your company. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about what we think about that in a second. Who has control over the R&D being done? So they've tried to say, well, if the ethics board has oversight over what you're doing, and it's the university ethics board or the hospital ethics board, it's not your MPC that's controlling the R&D. So again, they're using that as another way to say that the R&D is not on behalf of the professional corporation. We've also seen an argument around how the data that they're using is accessed. So are they obtaining access to clinical data through the hospital and their affiliation there, or do they have independent contracts with patients that they're bringing in to do trials? And again, leaning towards if the data is coming through the hospital or university, then the R&D belongs to them. And then finally, IP ownership is another thing that's coming up. So often what we see is that either the doctors as individuals own the sole IP rights to the work they're doing, or there's a contract with the hospital where they have some partial right, or they have a right to exercise IP ownership should they want to. But typically it's not owned by the hospital or university solely. So next slide, I will cover a little bit of analysis on these issues and sort of the questions that we're asking ourselves about how we can sort of, I guess, argue against these points. So the first real question I have is, how do we make a distinction between the R&D obligation of a doctor under their appointment to a hospital or university versus R&D that's done on behalf of the MPC? So, for example, if an R&D contract, the R&D obligation under an appointment letter is you're expected to spend 10% of your time at a minimum on R&D, and then a doctor goes on to spend 50% of their time on research and development or just research in general, are we then able to say that the additional 40% above the minimum obligation was really undertaken over and above the obligation to the university or hospital, or is it an all or nothing thing? A CRA is sometimes trying to just basically use an all or nothing argument and say, well, because of your affiliation with the university and the fact that you're accessing all of these resources because of that affiliation, you basically are doing everything on their behalf. And even if you go far above and beyond what you've been obligated to do for your appointment, we don't really care. So our opinion is that is really not fair, and it sort of takes away the whole incentive part of things. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next point, which is these doctors are not remunerated typically by the university or the hospital separately for this work for R&D. So their only income is their clinical activities where they're able to bill through OHIP or the other provincial plans. And then this is where AFP and APP come in. This was designed to actually top these doctors up where they're doing research and academic activity, and this fund is meant to provide them with additional funding to sort of cover off the fact that they're now being required to do these things. So is it reasonable to then say that for the 10% of research, and there's also other activities that they're required to do for the appointment, that this AFP, APP covers that, and can you then separate off the R&D they've done for the obligation from then any research they do separate to that for the MPC and make a claim for the costs over and above? The other thing is the research as defined in the hospital appointment is not necessarily a straight equivalency to SHRED, as we know, and as many CRA reviewers will tell us, R&D is not SHRED, so there's lots of activities in there that wouldn't be SHRED eligible. So again, how do we make the distinction and make the separation there? And what really is the relevance of IP ownership here in this case versus the right to exploit, results? If the doctors are doing the work and we can say the MPC is at the very least jointly contributing to a project that's being undertaken with the hospital, do they not then have the rights to exploit the results for their business of running a clinical practice? What is the relevance of who's published in a paper, the results? Again, take an example of software where open source results might be published by an individual working for a software company. Nonetheless, the software company is one who funded this and paid for it to be done to solve a commercial problem. And then again, to what degree is a hospital or university really directing the R&D? Typically, the agreements do not, specifically say what research they want the doctor doing. In fact, it says they want the doctor to self-direct that. And really, the ethics board and other things are just regulatory oversight to make sure that certain policies and procedures that are in line with the university policies are followed. So then on the next slide, let me just wait for that to pop up. Yeah, so this is just kind of talking about one other really interesting scenario where you have a medical professional corporation that has expenses over and above these salaries of these doctors that are appointed or obligated to the hospital. So one example we've seen is where they may have fellows that they're paying separately as employees on staff who are under the direction of the doctors and have no specific, appointment that they have a research obligation under. They're being paid by the medical professional corporation. So in an event where CRA is saying the project is being carried out by the doctor as an individual on behalf of the hospital, but then the MPC is paying costs out of pocket towards that project as well, what are our options in that scenario, or what implications does that have? Is it a joint project, or does that just show that the CRA's argument doesn't hold any water? So that's sort of the first prong of the argument, just talking about the fact that CRA's position currently, at least in what we've seen, is that the doctors just can't even be performing shred because they are obligated to the hospital. And I'm going to hand it over now to Nick to talk about AFP and some analysis on that sort of
Andrea.
fallback position.